Good morning, Life Point Church. Let's get started on day 4 of our devotion for this week. We've been talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, specifically about Jacob this week, and how God is the God of the fearful. So what is the big problem with fear? If God is the God of the fearful and He will help us to trust Him and move beyond our fears, is there really a problem with having fear in your life? There is. Here's the problem. Fear will lead you into more sin. Fear is not generally a sin to itself, but it does lead us into sin, such as in Isaac's life, where it causes him to be dishonest. And that's the next part we're going to look at. We talked yesterday about how a famine hit the land, and instead of going to Egypt, he obeyed the voice of God and stayed right where he was. And he was in a land called Gerar. Now, while he was in Gerar, Genesis 26 verse 7 says, "The men of that place asked him, 'Who's your wife? Who is this person?' And he said, 'Oh, she's my sister. This isn't my wife, this is my sister.' For he feared to say she's my wife because he didn't want the men of that place to kill him for Rebekah because she was beautiful." So this is, again, almost carbon copy to what we saw Abraham do when he was faced with a situation. So Isaac did okay in not running off to Egypt. He chose not to go that direction. He chose to stay and obey God where he was at. But then he falls right into this sin of dishonesty. What caused this sin? It was his fear. It says in that verse, it was his fear. He was afraid that the men of that place would kill him for Rebekah. Perhaps that is why in Revelation chapter 28, verse 8, the fearful are listed among the ones that are in that lake of fire. That's a very interesting concept to look at that verse and say, the fearful are in the lake of fire? Oh God, I'm afraid sometimes. Does that mean I have sinned? No, it doesn't mean that you have sinned to be afraid. Fear becomes a sin when we choose to let it cripple us, to not follow the voice of God, to allow us to become disobedient, to become dishonest, or to become, in our own way, trying to be self-sufficient, and we shove away God. That is why it is often found that when you have fear in your life, it will beget sin in your life. Why is it that that's listed there? Because in 2 Timothy 1:7 it says, God has not given us the spirit of fear. He has given us the power, the love, and the sound mind. So it is our job to put off our fears, to give them to Him, to trust Him, to put aside our fears, and to walk in power and in love and in a sound mind. But despite all of this, despite their sin in lying, God protected Isaac and Rebekah. The Philistines did not harm them. Perhaps the king learned from his experience with Abraham and Sarah, because amazingly, this is still the same king that dealt with this exact situation with Abraham and Sarah. And so here he is, he's dealing with Abraham's son now, and the same exact situation happens. When the truth came out, Abimelech gave his people strict orders not to touch Isaac or Rebekah on pain of death. Abimelech had crossed paths with this God of Abraham before, and he knew that if his son is serving the same God Abraham was, I'm not crossing paths with him. Do not touch them. They are special people. Clearly, Isaac's fears were unfounded. Ask yourself, how often do I fear a possibility that God has already protected me from? How often do you stay up all night worrying about something or being afraid of something that God already took care of? Isaac lied. Isaac sinned because of a fear that God had already worked out a protection from. We cannot allow the fears in our life to take over who we are and who God has called us to be. He has called us to be honest. He has called us to be courageous, and we must walk in that calling that He has placed for us. We see Isaac's fears affect him in many ways. He had done well in some cases of his life, but he was still a man of fear. Isaac's fears made him retreat and give ground to the Philistines. Isaac prospered in the Philistines' land. That's where he was. He was in Philistia, in Gerar in Philistia. And so while he was there, the famine was still going on in his country, but he had to make a living. So he began to dig wells, just like his father had, to care for his livestock and to grow some crops. Eventually, God began to bless where he was at. So eventually the Philistines began to envy him because he was having such good success. And finally, King Abimelech asked him to leave their land. Isaac went to the valley of Gerar, which was a wadi, or a dry stream bed. So this is a cracked, dry place in that era of time where there used to be a river there, and now there's not. But that's where he stayed, and he was a pretty smart guy because it wasn't an ideal land, but he said, hey, if there was water here once, maybe the river's underneath of us. So he began to dig wells, just like his father did. His fears did not stop him from acting. Where others saw only a dry stream bed, Isaac saw potential. He began to dig again the wells that Abraham had dug, and he called them by the names Abraham had called them. This is a turning point in Isaac's life. This is a point where he says, if it worked for my daddy, it's going to work for me. That same relationship that he had, that God provided for him, I'm choosing right now as the head of this tribe. I'm stepping into my calling, and it's going to work for me. The Philistines came to that place, and they began to drive Isaac's herdmen away from those wells. They wanted those 2 wells, and they began to push them and fight them until they were away. Could it be that Isaac was afraid? Certainly Isaac was not as bold as his father, because when this happened with Abraham, Abraham mounted his men into an army and attacked. But Isaac did not handle it that way. He chose to retreat. He was in full retreat. It seemed like he was fleeing from what was rightfully his. And so in this moment, he has to make a decision. I know that he's my God. I am taking control. I am walking in my right as the head of this tribe to dig these wells, to call this place ours. But now somebody's attacking me for it, and I don't know, do I have the right spiritually? Do you have the right to handle the ground that you are trying to take spiritually? And that is where the devil is going to attack you. If you've said, this is my spot, this is my well, this is my family, I'm defending it, I'm fighting for it, Satan is going to try to attack you. And you can either retreat and give it all back to him, or you can make the decision to fight. And that is the decision where we're going to leave Isaac today, and we're going to pick up tomorrow and see where things went from here. God bless you, and I'll see you back tomorrow for part 5.